Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord presents you with a bevy of units to choose for your army as you conquer Calradia. From the stylistic knights of Western Europe and Vlandia to the steppe warriors of the Khuzait, there is plenty of diversity across all of the 6 factions. With that diversity comes a number of issues though, and as Taleworlds balances and tweaks all the units on a pretty frequent basis, I'm still wanting more from some units or the entire roster of some factions in Bannerlord. In today's video, I want to go through each faction and talk about some of the gripes I have with the existing layout or units. Then go into what my suggestions would be to tweak or make them feel better. If you don't want to sit through the entire video, you can jump to maybe the faction that interests you the most by navigating to the chapters denoted in the timeline. For a quick summary, I think that all of the factions have at least one unit that needs retooling to fit the overall feel maybe of the army better, with Battania getting perhaps an entire tree rework. Another point I will say is that I think that the noble lines, or the special tier 6 line that every faction gets, needs to feel more unique or custom to the army. Consider that of the 6 factions, 5 of their noble lines end with some form of heavy cavalry or heavy cavalry hybrid unit. I don't think that's a bad thing, but maybe make them all feel different. Sturgia have a heavy cavalry that uses 2-handed weapons perhaps. Vlandian heavy cavalry using lances only. Like lances and one-handed weapons. Aserai using one-handed shield and throwing. Khuzait using polearm and archery. It's sort of like that now, but it still tries to be too much of a come-all unit and ends up kind of falling short in my mind. Before we get started, I will say that these are just some proposed ideas, and I'm totally open to anything Taleworlds decides to do or anything else you guys come up with. Like I always say, Taleworlds reads the forums, Reddit, watches YouTube, and reads comments, so please be vocal and respectful about what you want changed. They've done a good job of listening to the community, and version 1.6.0 promises to be a big change to the game that I am excited for. So join me in this journey as we discuss how Taleworlds can improve Bannerlord units. To get our video started off, we'll go into Vlandia, and we're going to do this pretty low tech. I'm pretty much just going to be looking at the encyclopedia. For the Battania section, I'll flash something on the screen, but for the most part, it's me looking at the individual units, their loadouts, and talking about their skills and stats and whatnot. And just as a point of reference, this is using main branch 1.5.7. Beta branch 1.5.8 is still got quite a few bugs in it, and there have been some skill adjustments in 1.5.8. I will kind of call that out now, but for all intents and purposes, we're mainly talking about the feel and the overall objective of an army, and less so the actual skill points of these units. So to start out here for Vlandia, we're going to jump down into the spearman line. So we get the spearman into the billman, which branches into the volgier or the pikeman. Now, looking at the pikeman, I just kind of find it very useless, to be totally honest with you. It's got everything that the pikeman has, pretty much nothing that the volgier doesn't already have. The volgier also gets a broad 2-handed weapon. It gets a Francesca as far as a throwing weapon goes, and overall I like its armor loadout. So there's no reason to go for a pikeman. But what I think would make a pikeman very enjoyable, I guess you could say, would be 2 simple things. Add the ability for the unit to brace, and we know that this is entered into multiplayer, and it will come to single player in time. But I think if the pikeman can brace and the volgier can't, that alone would make it different and diverse and have it actually have a use. Then the second thing I would do here is just simply give it 1 to 2 stacks of the throwing axes. I'd say give it 2, since you've got the 2-handed weapon on the volgier, and you have the 2-handed weapon on the volgier, and then you have the volge on the volgier. Just go ahead and give these guys 2 throwing axes in that stead. I think that is enough to kind of give it a little bit more staying power, have it have a longer or wider threat range. But one thing I do want to talk about, actually, we'll maybe wait for this, but I think it's worth bringing up that almost every single unit in the game has spears, but doesn't use their spears. So I think with bracing, it will change the dynamic of spearmen in the game to the point right now where almost every single, like, okay, well, I have a spearman here, but This infantry's got almost the same loadout, you know? The swordsman here also has a spear. So I think once they change bracing and how that works and how some weapons can brace and some cannot, it will change the dynamic of this Vlandian swordsman versus this Vlandian pikeman. So that is something to consider. Now, the other thing I want to discuss with Vlandia, and it's really the only other note for them, is the light cavalry option. I think it's cool, because it gives you the ability to get into a heavy cavalry choice with the Vanguard. It's a very comparable unit to the Banner Knight line, the noble line of Vlandia. But if we look at the increase of noble units across the board, right, having their higher accessibility from all the towns across the realm, in addition, 1.5.8 adds it so that a power level of 200 or higher for notables now allows them to have these elite units. So it's way easier to get your Banner Knights than it was before. So I find this to be a bit of a redundancy in the Vlandian line. I understand why it was here. It was a way to give you, the user, a chance to get access to heavy Vlandian cavalry without having to jump into that noble line. I get it. But I think, just to give a little spice here, I think that they should move away from this being a heavy cav option and instead make it a crossbow cavalry option. Drop the lance, give it a crossbow and a bag of bolts, and maybe just a sword. A sword and a shield would be great, but it might be a little too much. And I think that's one problem that a lot of the units in Bannerlord have, is they are too much of that jack of all trades, master of none. But I know the end of that sentence is better a master of some than a master of one. So I guess you could split both hairs here. You could say, oh, well, it's better that my unit can do more stuff than just one thing. But my point remains that having crossbow cavalry as an option would be really, really exciting, because we don't have that in the game, period. And it is an ability in the game that you can use a crossbow on a horse. So make Vlandia that pure crossbow army, having mobile crossbow platforms with kind of a lighter cav option that is using crossbows, and you have your emplaced crossbow archers. So that squares up our Vlandians. Again, for the most part, I think that if we're jumping over to the actual noble line, I think sticking with how they have the nobles as it is, with a heavy cav emphasis of a lance and a sword and shield, is the right call. I just don't think that every single cavalry option should be just like this for noble lines. But let's move now into Sturgia and talk about their archers. Sturgia has gotten a number of reworks with their infantry line, right? Having armor added into the berserkers, having this whole portion just retooled and re-equipped and a bunch of different things, having lances added to these guys, spears added to these guys. So a lot of things have happened to Sturgia. But two big things still remain an anchor in a negative way to Sturgia. And one is the archer line. So the woodsman progresses down into the hunter, archer, and then veteran bowman. The biggest issue with the veteran bowman line is that they have poor bows and poor quivers, or poor arrows, all the way down to this nice tier 5. This guy has a Nordic short bow, which is garbage. You start off with one of these. Then barbed arrows, which is just equally as bad. So what I think you need to do is upgrade all of the bows of all of the Sturgians, and then upgrade some of the arrows. They don't all need to be the top tier arrow, but they do need to feel like you're actually getting your money's worth, paying the daily wage of 12 on these guys for a tier 5 unit that just can't really perform like any other archer can in the game. They do have pretty good skill here, right? I mean, bow skill at 140. I think some of them have best in class. I think the veteran bowman has best in class compared to the archer, which also has, the Sturgian master archer, which also has 140. But if you have a crap bow and you have crap arrows, it doesn't really matter, right? And also, I would say change their one-handed sword to a two-handed axe. And it's very Sturgian, right? Give that presence of axe a little bit wider in their army. Or just even at least do it like a one-handed axe. I feel like the axe itself has a really good threat range compared to a sword. And it also fits the overall feel and aesthetic of the army in a really great, cool, and fun way. So I would love to see an axe or a two-handed axe swapped in here. So basically you're looking at Sturgian fiends if you want to compare them over to Battania and their noble line. Now, speaking of noble lines, let's switch over to the noble line for Sturgia. And I think it's probably one of the biggest trouble noble lines, because the first 3 units are a decent infantry option, and then it hard right turns into a pretty good cavalry option. Not an amazing one, but pretty damn good nonetheless. And I think that Sturgia's focus has always really been heavy infantry, right? Long lines, a long shield wall line, right? Just marching downrange at you. And I think that that needs to be what happens here with the noble line. Swap this out, take the Variag and just keep it down. Make the Drusinik and the Drusinik champion, don't put them on a horse, just keep them on foot. And I think that keeping them as a heavy infantry with the best armor in category, like increasing it overall, you can even just keep this armor. You can even keep this armor. Just put them on foot, give them high athletics, and then equip them with spears, shields, swords, and 2-handed axes. Or just a spear and a shield and a 2-handed axe. Give them that really strong, heavy hitting power. But I think that this kind of falls back on what I said before, right? Like, I don't want all these units to be these these jack of all trades. I think that there does need to be an emphasis. So maybe you have them have a very high 2-handed skill, so they prefer the 2-handed axe, but know to use the sword and the spear and shield in a shield wall or other formations where that makes a little bit more sense. This way they can threaten, again, I say this term so much, but threaten a wider range, and they fit the overall feel of the army. When I'm playing as Sturgia, and I'm lucky enough to get their noble units because their lands haven't been pulverized by Khuzait, it's not enough cavalry for me to be able to use them sufficiently in their later tiers. They almost always kind of get relegated to a small unit of 8 to 10 soldiers max. And I usually put them with their the hardened and horse raiders, hardened brigands and horse raiders, just to give them a little bit more unit size. So I think keeping them on the ground as infantry and having the only cavalry for Sturgia as harassment, skirmish, throwing javelin style cavalry, I think it's perfectly fine. And especially if you bolster these archers, I think it would fix a lot of the issues when you're playing as Sturgia. Khuzait has probably one of the best troop lines, and not just simply its actual skills, but I mean its organization. It's really neat, it makes a lot of sense, it's really easy. One unit branches into 2, you either have cavalry on the left or you have infantry on the right, and then that branches into either archers or spearmen, and then either horse archers or heavy cavalry. And I think that's a really awesome breakdown. So I have actually very little issue with Khuzait. The only issue I do have is with the spear infantry and the dark cannon. And this is a universal issue between these two, but it applies to not just them. Another example of who this would apply to would be the legionaries with their pilum. Now, when we look at the spear infantry, they have jagged throwing spears. Look at the Darkin, they have triangular throwing spears. Now, the issue here is that the game does not look at these as throwing weapons. It looks at them as pole arms, so it says type polearm, with an alternative mode of throwing. So if your character has got 60 throwing skill here, or in this case, this one's got 60 throwing skill as well, they don't benefit from any perks in the throwing category because the game calculates this as a polearm perk, not a throwing perk. So I think that Taleworlds has to decide, is this intended to be a polearm that can also be thrown, or is this intended to be a throwing weapon that can also double as a polearm in times of need? So that is, and I'd say since it says spear infantry, it's probably intended to be a polearm. But the reason you need to make this distinction is that you get the abilities such as well prepared, which gives you an additional stack of throwing weapons, or additional 1 ammo of throwing weapons that you don't get advantage of because you don't get that trigger to kick in. As well as all the other damage increasing throwing perks just don't kick in because, again, the game looks at this as a polearm. So this is more of a technical thing than an actual, hey, this is how we could change this to make Khuzait feel better, because Khuzait, for the most part, is a perfect army list. Everything is very neatly done and organized, even their noble line. Torbud. is very well done. Like I've said before, if everyone's got a certain specific emphasis, these guys do it perfectly, right? They have the exact one I said. They'll give them bows and then a polearm. Well, bam, here you go. These guys they do have a dual use, but it's mainly that the use that they're dueling in is hyper focused. This guy doesn't have a shield and a lance and a bow and an arrow and a polearm and all these other things. It's very well done. So I think as a whole, Khuzait could be the blueprint for every other race to at least just follow a general dynamic to making your army list makes a little bit more sense. But that kind of concludes our Khuzait, because as we already know, they're very strong. Moving into the Imperial Army, we have probably the most heavily armored army of Bannerlord, and it's one that I, again, don't have many issues with. The Imperial Army is done pretty well. Makes a lot of sense as far as its unit diversity and progression goes. But I think the biggest issue with the Imperial Army is the same thing we had with Khuzait. When we look at the Pilum, it again falls into that same issue. It's a polearm, and these guys have 60 throwing, and the Legionary has 60 throwing. Is he supposed to benefit from the throwing or from his polearm skill? And again, this one is so small too that his massive 130 polearm is kind of negated as far as his reach goes. He will probably switch to his sword because they will be so close. And that kind of falls back on what I was talking about earlier, is all these spearman units also having a one-handed weapon, and they almost never use their polearm because the melee gets so intense so fast that they pull their sword out because it's a better weapon for the range that they're in. The AI will calculate the relative range to them and their opponent and how fast their opponent's going to determine if it's going to be using a polearm, the spear, if it's against cavalry, if it's a fast moving target, or if it's going to be a slower moving target that will stay in melee range, it will pull out the sword. So it's almost always going to default to that sword. So that is the issue here with Imperial that I see. Now the other one is the Cataphract. Now don't get me wrong, the Imperial Cataphract or the Elite Cataphract is probably one of my favorite units in the game. It looks really cool. It's really awesome from like a really cool historical reference standpoint. I like it a lot. But I think that for the Imperial Army, this could be a heavy line infantry instead. You could call it the Centurion, and he has a lot of the same benefits of the Legionary, but even more souped up. Let's jump back to the Legionary real quick. So I think one of the biggest things that could really make this guy cool or stand out is you give him good armor, you give him a shield, large square shield, make him just stand right in front. I'd really love to see an actual scutum, the actual Roman military shield. I know it's not really fit for the era, but it'd be cool to get that big, huge rectangular shield and a one-handed sword and then 2 stacks of javelin. Like, have this guy be a character that does throw javelins, and then have his throwing skill so high that he gets the skill that penetrates shields. I would love to see that, because you only really see it on yourself or maybe a hero that has that skill at that level. But give me that heavy infantry that's scary to go against, because all of them are throwing their first 1 or 2 stacks of throwing weapons and they're just penetrating the shields of my front line. That's terrifying. That'd be horrifying, because otherwise your shield wall is just going to absorb a good percentage of those javelin chucks and a lot of the archery coming down range from the Imperial Army. Make it really scary. The Cataphract line could then be kind of shoehorned into some sort of mercenary line, or make it a part of a revamped, revamped minor clan. So, okay, the Cataphracts now exist in that kind of continuum rather than being a direct portion of your main line. Or, of course, you could swap out something like the Bucellarii and put it over in this section, so that you get, at the very end, a tier 5, just normal Cataphract, not elite Cataphract. And the Manavliaton, too, I think that the Manavliaton and the Bucellarii are 2 units that have really suffered over time that used to be quite good. They used to be very standout units, and as they tweaked horse archers because of Khuzait, Bucellarii suffered greatly, because now they're very lackluster. And Manavliaton has suffered over time because they've kind of changed the way that 2-handed shock infantry, a la the Falksman and the Berserker, have worked over time. So I think that tweaking those out, or maybe even removing the Manavliaton outright and just giving you Cataphracts in that slot, might make a lot more sense. This way you get access to very late level reliable cavalry, and you have a noble line that is just very tanky and very scary to go against. So those would be my suggestions for a tweak or an overhaul to the Empire or Imperial roster. Our second to last army to talk about is the Aserai, and I actually really enjoy them more so than I had originally thought I would. But I think the biggest hangup in the roster is really these guys right here. The Skirmisher kind of breaks the mold of the otherwise very nice and solid progression system, kind of like what you get with Khuzait. Because the Skirmisher doesn't match the latter two of its unit. I guess you could say the Mamluk Regular also has that issue too, because this guy is not a throwing weapon or a horse archer. These guys are horse archers, but the Skirmisher here uses a throwing weapon, a spear, and a shield. I think drop the javelin and drop the spear and give it a bow and arrow so that it can kind of play well with Aserai Archer and then the Master Archer. Keep it the same name. You don't need to change anything about that. Swap throwing with bow, which it already has anyway. So just kind of keep that skill level as it is and make it an actual archer. That's really the only problem I have for the most part with this roster. I think it's a very solid one. I do think maybe this character should just have a two-handed axe out the gate, but I understand why they decided to stylistically go this route, because if you just go with a two-handed weapon at tier 2, it's not going to make it to tier 3 as easily as it would right now. So I'm okay. Originally, I had an issue with these two being so similar. And at one point, remember, one of them didn't have a shield. And we very rarely saw the Mamluk progress into these other portions. So I'm okay with that now that I've kind of played this roster a little bit more. And even the Ferris, which is actually a very fun and cool unit, has gotten a lot of retooling and reworking, and it fits pretty well into its intended scope. I do think, though, that maybe dropping the spear and just giving it more throwing weapons would fit as a more, okay, I'm going to be a throwing weapon, one-handed shield, one-handed sword and shield cavalry character. But I do understand as well, though, that I believe that Taleworlds has realized that not having cavalry with a spear makes them very unable to threaten against other cavalry. They can fight fine against infantry, but they still are kind of somewhat limited because their reach is so limited. So I think that pretty much the unanimous decision to give almost every single unit on a horse some form of long-reaching weapon, is if it's not just solely a horse archer, was a decision because they just could not fight well. Remember like I said, the Sturgian Brigand. Hardened Brigand. These guys didn't used to have the leaf-shaped spear. This is actually a pretty recent convention as I think of 1.5.4. So I think that this is just a stylistic decision based off of how the combat system works. So what I've said might absolutely be negligible. It might just need to be there. But I would like to see more throwing stacks of the Jareed on the Vanguard Ferris. But let's move now into Battania, the one army that I think needs the most work and the most help to actually kind of rise above. All right, the big bad boy in Battania. Now, Battania has a lot of really fun and interesting units, especially in its noble line, right? The Fian is probably one of the best units in the game, bar none. And I think the biggest issue is the overall layout of the unit tree is a little nonsensical. Essentially, when I look at it, I'm like, oh, okay, this here, that does make a little sense. But then I really drilled down on it and how the units apply to the battlefield, it doesn't quite make as much sense. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to overlay my proposed changes to the tree on top of this, and I'm going to talk about them from that angle, and I'll keep it there the entire time. I might click some units that you'll then see on the left side, and it won't be as obtrusive, but hopefully it's easy to follow, as this will be kind of a little confusing. But I think the biggest issue is how the unit divides. It goes from volunteer to clan warrior, and then or to woodrunner, and I think that's a good first start. Matt, that's your tier 2 step. But from there, I'm proposing that clan warrior goes down into trained warrior or skirmisher. And then skirmisher go to veteran skirmisher and then wildling. And then trained warrior go into either picked warrior and then oathsworn, or Falksmen and then Veteran Falksmen. So you see what I'm doing here is I'm keeping all of the all of the infantry, or at least people on foot, in one specific branch. And even moreover, we'll go how I would change the skirmisher lineup. But then we look at the Woodrunner would progress into Raider, which could be renamed to something else, and then to Scout, our first cavalry unit, and then into either the Horseman for a pure heavy cavalry option, or the Mounted Skirmisher for a more skirmish javelin style cavalry option. And here's how I would then tweak those individual things. So if we're talking about the skirmisher line first, the skirmisher as it is uses javelins. So does the veteran skirmisher, and then so does the wildling. And I will say in some of the more recent patches, we've had a number of equipment changes for the scout, the horseman, the veteran falksman, all three of these skirmishers, and for the oathsworn. So they've gotten a lot more durable, and I think that that's really great. But I think that honestly, the javelin portion of the army, while really cool, doesn't ultimately stand the test of time. I think that after you get rid of your javelins, I mean, a wildling honestly is better than an oathsworn in my opinion. It has better javelins, it has almost the exact same loadout, their skills are slightly different. So for me, the wildling actually outshines the oathsworn. And it only recently did it get its skills swapped around to make the oathsworn actually have the skills of the items it has. So I think kind of like what you get with Khuzait, right? Khuzait has a horse archer base line unit, and then its noble line is an archer unit, or I'm sorry, a horse archer unit. I think do the same thing for Battania. Change the skirmisher, veteran skirmisher, and wildling into a bow unit rather than a javelin throwing weapon unit. And the loadout should be one-handed sword, shield, and a bow with a quiver. And maybe the wildling gets a longbow because, you know, it's that tier 5. This way, you have a differentiation between the two, just like you do for Khuzait. Khuzait's horse archer unit in its baseline has a sword, a shield, and a bow and arrow. And its noble line has a polearm and a bow and arrow. So do the same thing like you do for Battania. Okay, the Fian has a two-handed sword and a long bow and arrow. So its generic line, its baseline, just give that a sword and shield and a bow and arrow. I think it fits really well. It plays long term into your mid to late game, and you won't feel like your tier 3 range unit in the skirmisher is lackluster unless you supplement it with nobles. So that, I think, it alone is a really huge change to just the loadout and feel. Even if they didn't take like this proposed tree rework, just changing the Woodrunner, Skirmisher, and Veteran Skirmisher, Wildling, the Skirmisher, Veteran Skirmisher, and Wildling to Archers is a substantial change and adds to the staying power of Battania. Now, when we move over to the Trained Warriors, the Picked Warriors, and the Oathsworn, we see that they've got throwing skill, but then only the Oathsworn takes advantage of that throwing skill with javelins. I think swap all of them for throwing axes. It fits the feel of the army. They all get a little bit more threat range, and they can just do a little bit more for what their little bang for their buck is. And it fits this overall feel too of what I'm trying to create in this new list of having everyone have some sort of range component. The Clan Warrior, give them throwing daggers, something that we don't see outside of just the minor clan unit in the hand or the ember hand or whatever it is, the imperial minor clan. Give the clan warriors throwing weapons, so give them those little throwing daggers. So it makes the trained warrior, picked warrior, and oathsworn narratively fit to have throwing weapons. Now, when we move over to the Falksmen, which would be the other portion of the infantry list, remember this is our new proposed one. It would go trained warrior down to Falksmen, then veteran Falksmen. Just in my opinion, I've always found the Falksman itself to be lackluster because it only has a two-handed weapon. Give it a one-handed weapon, or give it throwing weapons. Give it three stacks or 2 stacks of throwing axes, and have the Falks, the two-handed weapon that the Falksman uses, have it crush through on overhanded swings. That way it can actually be a little bit scarier to use. The veteran Falksman gets a Rumphalia, which It's a pole arm, so it doesn't have that kind of viability. So give it more throwing weapons, or give it a one-handed weapon too, so it can be useful in sieges. That's the biggest issue I find with the Volksman, is that it can only be good in field battles, and only used in field battles wherein it can get a flank or a rear charge onto something. If it's used in the front line, it will get blocked by other units, and it just becomes, well, an unfortunate casualty. Now, moving to the other portion, we would sub the Raider into the this new cavalry line, or this new different line, I guess you could say. The wood runner would then progress into the Raider, and the Raider would need to feel similar to everything else in this line. So give it replace its throwing axes with javelins. Keep javelins as a big reoccurring thing here. So the wood runner has javelins. Well, now the Raider has javelins, and we move into the scouts. Again, give the scout a javelin. Keep it so that you have a choice now between going from scout to horseman, which would then be your heavy cavalry option, and give the horseman javelin, or you jump into the mounted skirmisher, which you're focusing primarily on using javelins on a horse. You're not going to get a benefit of a spear. Give it an extra stack of javelins, so it's got 2 stacks of javelins and a sword and a shield. So you can see with this proposed change to Battania, it is scary because everything has an ability to throw a weapon. They don't have the biggest and the longest shields. They don't have the biggest armor, but make them more glass cannony. Make it very scary to charge them, because they're going to be chucking javelins from all different angles. They've got a lot of different archers to do a lot of peppering into you, but as soon as you can get your teeth into them, they cannot last a prolonged fight. I think Battania's strength should be in getting as much damage as it can out as fast as it can, because it cannot be that kind of long-term fight in the way that the Imperial Army can, right? It can kind of slowly plod down range, take all the shots that it can because it's got heavy armor and big shields, and then last the test of time, but it won't be able to maybe out-damage another army that's got a higher damage threshold. I think each one of these armies needs to have that characteristic that really differs it, not from just simply, oh, this unit is equipped like this, so it's a heavy infantry unit. Like, it has to have that cool feel to it that makes it a little, step above. Now, moving into the Fiends, this can be a real quick decision here. God, that helmet is always so jarring to me. All these guys, just swap out their one-handed skill. I think that's all you really need to do, right? I think almost all of them have had it done now. Yeah, pretty much all of them have had it done. I was gonna say is the two-handed sword, good, yeah. At one point, I think the first two only had one-handed weapons, even though they had the two-handed skill. So make sure all of them have the two-handed weapons. So that seems to be fine. And like I said, keep these really cool two-handed archers alongside their sword and board bros in the baseline. I think that's all you really would need to do for Battania. And at that, it brings our video to a close here, guys. We're here on the party screen to kind of sum things up. I think that for the most part, all of the armies are in a really good place. They just need a couple retoolings here and there to make them really feel like they're that faction's army with that faction's focus. And like I was really just saying with Battania, I think making every single army have a very specific feel that is characteristic to them, right? Like when we look at Khuzait, you're going to be getting tons of horse archers. When I look at Vlandia, I know I'm going to be seeing heavy cavalry just slam into me from downrange. I think we kind of get muddied here when we look at Sturgia, which is supposed to have heavy line infantry, or when we look at Battania, which is supposed to kind of be this hit and run style of faction, it kind of gets a little muddied. And I don't think it's far off from being where it needs to be. It just needs these kind of tweaks and sliders and valves and all these other things that I'm trying to make a point of that not making a point of at all. But either way, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what you think could be really changed with some of these units to bring them up to a specific point that you have in mind for that army. Whatever it is that you want to share about it, please, by all means, guys, let it be known on Reddit, on the forums, in the comment section, wherever. Share your opinion, be respectful about it, and I'm sure that Taleworlds will take that into consideration, as they have been doing for the last 11 months. But as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment below, all that fun action. But have a good one, and take care.